So we've gone over the helmet, and now I'm going to start going into the body. So for the chest piece, normally what I tend to do is start sculpting from the actual base mesh and just start sculpting up a chest piece. But in this case, it's easy enough just to throw a cube in there and start going to Dynamesh and mask and inflate and do all that stuff. So, or you can start with a base mesh, mask, extract, get a piece from your base mesh and start sculpting. So that way you can maybe kind of avoid the whole process of conforming it to the body, but it doesn't really matter, it doesn't take that long. And just like the helmet, and would I normally do a fully decked out helmet, refined and stuff, and bolts on it and all that good stuff, and then go, okay, now let's start the rest of the body. Not usually, but the helmet does inform quite a bit of the actual character sometimes, so I can take the design aspects of the helmet or the language or the detail parts or the detail breakup and kind of apply that to the rest of the body as well. And if you can do that to the helmet and get that signed off on, you can do it the rest of the body, and hopefully it'll work out. But generally I wouldn't, I don't know if I'd recommend that all the time, but whatever. I did it this time. And this is just, adding base meshes to kind of work with. I'm not going into Maya and making a cylinder and then bringing it in. It's topology brush, make a belt, or any number. You could use the curve insert brushes to kind of make a quick belt, or there's a ton of ways just to kind of make stuff within ZBrush, especially now with the new Z modeler. And it seems like more recently the sculpts I've been doing have been, sculpting from the base mesh and just being really kind of dirty back here. Not back here. Years ago when I did this, it was a little more, I modeled a little tighter to start out with, and it actually ended up saving me quite a bit of time. So I don't know, maybe I'll go back to that style of, spend a little bit more time with cleaner shapes and maybe a little less time sculpting from base mesh, and then I'll reap the rewards of that later on with a cleaner concept sculpt that I can clean up faster or rebuild faster. And at this point, even if I wanted to break those off into separate panels, which eventually I probably would for like a cinematic or super duper production model, I'd still end up sculpting it just like that first, and then deciding, okay, now do I go through a topology brush or Z-spheres or any number of topology methods and breaking off those individual little leather plates, and then detailing them out, or box modeling some screw ports in them or whatever. And just like the GDC girl, I got the suspender straps in there. Just looking for stuff to kind of put in there. Here's a interesting clip. I think that was actually from a NASA spacesuit, that clip right there. And like I said, back when I did this one, it seems like a lot more noodly. I generally wouldn't nowadays go in and put clips and stuff. I'd get the straps in there and put them all over the body and evaluate and blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. There's something to be said for maybe getting noodly a little early and kind of feeling stuff out. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's fast enough. You saw how fast that was, so do what you gotta do. and then trying to get the neck integration, figure out how I want to do that. And I guess as you're working, you can always go through and, combine that head, decimate it down to one solid piece if it's just concept-y. That'll keep your subtools manageable and your file sizes manageable, as well as the ability to go, okay, you know what, I want to rotate this head around to make sure it doesn't really interfere that much with, because that's one thing I didn't do with the GDC female was take her head and then rotate it and then realize, oh my god, her neck brace is obviously way too high and she's going to have a hard time looking around if, I don't move this. And I never did because I didn't go through that step. It was just run and gun, and I didn't follow all the steps that I was talking about you should do. But that's a good argument for decimating and combining your subtools and getting those all into one subtool so you can kind of do a little bit of animation tests even in the sculpty, concepty phase. And of course, ideally, you're passing this all the way through the pipeline to the end engine and getting it on your rig and getting it, you have archetypes ready that have weighting information on them, and you can get automated game resin UVs and textures and materials and get those into game, weighted on your animation sets, run through the game with your sketch and evaluate all the way to the very end at a very early stage and make those decisions and not wait until 2 months into production when final art's in and then go, oh man, her head messes up. That really sucks. And this is where, unlike the chest, I'm just going to take the base body and just kind of sculpt some stuff. And if you're doing form-fitting stuff, that might make more sense. Or like I said, you can mask extract, whatever, to get pieces off of your base mesh that don't necessarily have to be your base mesh. And if you're going to sculpt on your base mesh, obviously duplicate it off so you don't lose it. And you can always refer back to it to make sure everything's going on the base mesh, because you can tend to kind of cut in deep and then don't realize that, oh, her shoulders are poking out of her shoulder pads. And occasionally that'll happen where you dynamesh something and your mesh just turns into holes. There's been some instances where I haven't really been able to fix that. It's just a matter of like dynameshing at a slightly lower resolution, going through, and sometimes it's just a matter of me remeshing and projecting, because sometimes it's just a really knotty mesh, but that's pretty rare. Usually dropping the resolution or inflating any problem areas I see, and then dynameshing will kind of close those holes so it doesn't get that paper thin webbing mesh. There's a cool handle. And yeah, once you've made a character, pull all the cool pieces off and I'll give you a head start. Ideally, you could pull finished pieces off and not touch them. And that's the other thing too, is if you're pulling from a library of predetermined meshes, it's all consistent. So if you're pulling from a library of all the same stuff, it's going to be all consistent, so everybody's using the same pieces, and that's a little bit more realistic. You don't have 10 army guys in a row from the same squadron or platoon or whatever, and they're all wearing drastically different or unique, everybody's wearing unique stuff. They're all going to have something of the same type. Some same pieces, some same straps, the same pockets, the same, all this stuff, it's the same. So obviously you're pulling from a library of the same assets. Not only is it going to save you time, it's also going to be a little bit more consistent. And here I am just pulling in crazy alphas and just seeing what happens. And this stuff was nice. And you can always, if you're just doing small, detaily stuff like this, always save your original re-topologized mesh that was just sub-D'd, so that you can use it as a game res, possibly. I mean, in this case, I probably wouldn't, because I would just bake all this stuff together. But, and again, doing the material breakup, so anywhere I'm putting wrinkles, I know that's going to be Marvelous Designer filler, or you can just sculpt it and bake it off. If it's small areas like this, I don't mind just kind of doing a little cloth sculpting and calling it a day, putting in some seams. But I did a male version of this that I probably won't be able to show you. But we'll see if I can cut some stuff out and be able to show you guys. But there's areas where I sculpted with cloth, and then those areas, I just went into Marvelous Designer, dropped some cloth in those areas, and then let it sim, and it was awesome. It was way better than my sculpt, especially in the big areas of cloth. And because it had things under, like mech parts underneath, you know, you sim a cloth over that, and you could use Maya end cloth or whatever you want to use, doesn't really matter. But in that case, I used Marvelous Designer, and it was able to kind of pick and stretch, like sit on top of those mech parts and really sell it, as opposed to me kind of faking it. I mean, if I was a better cloth sculptor, then I wouldn't have much of an argument, but I'm not, so I can use these tools, and it's faster than I am and better quality, so it's hard for me to argue. I mean, I guess I could go, okay, I'm going to sit here and really sculpt the hell out of cloth and be a master cloth sculptor. Or I can use cloth tools and get it done fast, and it looks great. Nothing wrong with that either. And I don't really like sculpting cloth all that much, if I'm being honest. Hair either. Like I said, kind of using the helmet to dictate the kind of stuff you would see on the body. And this is more of a, I guess, kind of a Furio look, but kind of a Mike Nash look, where it's going to be super mechy underneath, and then I'm just going to put cloth over it. But, you know, you never know if you're going to need variants or pieces, and even if you do put cloth over all this, you know, like I said, you'll have a variant, or you'll at least have the stuff underneath to kind of dictate how the cloth is going to deform. Now, I wouldn't go in and rebuild all this stuff necessarily if it's going to be cloth covered, but you know, if the cloth is just a variant, or you start out with cloth and then it loses cloth, or the cloth gets ripped off or burned off, then yeah, sure, rebuild it and make it all nice. And in this case, doing these straps and adding like thread detail, I don't know. I go back and forth. Probably I would just end up doing that in Painter nowadays if I had to. Go in there and do an insert mesh brush, curve brush, so I could keep the threads separate if I wanted to get that kind of fidelity, which I always do. I'm not gonna lie and go, oh, it never matters. It's like, oh, I always wish I had done that. But I don't know, thread detail, blech. But it's cool. It's really cool to do a nice render and zoom in on it and go, man, cloth and that thread, it's different material. And here I am just using the topology brush to kind of dictate, okay, so I've got all this mechy stuff, and if she's out in the desert running around, probably she's going to have some oily places she wants to be covered and not have sand sticking to it or whatever. So throw in some quick thickness, and it's cloth, so, you know, give it a clasp, give it a hook, poke some holes in it, and you can actually dictate like underneath the mesh where the hole should be. You know, it's like, oh, you know, I'll just build a cloth around those two ports. Like maybe those are important and those need to be plugged into something, Whatever. And of course, I'm sculpting cloth with symmetry on, which is kind of a big no-no. I've never seen symmetrical cloth wrinkles ever in my life, but it's a little faster. But of course, you can start out sculpting symmetrically, and then on the cloth just kind of break symmetry and put some broad strokes across symmetry because it just looks better. And just like before, just kind of push and pull that cloth, and the underneath stuff can kind of dictate where things need to go, what it needs to go around. So there's a little hole poking out, and then it leaves that little notch at the top of the shoulder. And the little eyelets and stuff. And this big broad stuff would be exactly the kind of stuff I'd probably end up taking into Marvelous Designer and just simming, or my end cloth and just simming. But you get the idea. As soon as I put a wrinkle on something and smooth it out, it's like, okay, yeah, I get that that's cloth. And then if you want to just put a quick texture on there and play it in game or whatever, that'll give you plenty of information to make good decisions off of long before you get in there and spend time doing cloth sims and final stuff. That took me 5 minutes to sculpt some wrinkles, as opposed to spending the time to go and do that for real. And then where I need to poke holes through the cloth, like through the handles, that was just a simple insert mesh brush, and then boolean that out. And it looks like I didn't quite poke that rectangle in far enough, so I've got a little bit of leave-ins back there, but it doesn't really affect what I'm doing. So, and also you can use pinch on your eyelets to squeeze those in. And it looks like I won't be getting all the way down to the legs, but it's the same exact process I did for the chest. And you notice I made it darker, and actually probably switch materials to Mech Pearl, and under render settings turn off shadows while you're retopologizing, so you can get underneath the chin there and kind of see a little bit better. And then Mech Pearl with a dark gray. You can see on the left the color I chose a dark gray is just so I can see the orange lines better from the topology. So whenever the underlying topology gets a little rougher or a little more inset, like recessed and stuff, not incest, recessed, that's when I usually grab Z-spheres and then do the top point to the bottom point and then do webbing across that, as opposed to topology brushes, which is going to follow the underlying geometry and kind of stick to it and get nasty and all that stuff. Cover up all this detail with some cloth, which is okay. Like I said, you can always do variants. It's a little bit more of a Cyrax ninja mechanical look, and that's just me creasing the edges. But what you could also do is go into your crease and then do crease tolerance or crease by angle or something like that. And it'll actually look at the topology and crease those edges for you. And usually it does 90, if not 100%, 90% of the job. And then I'll go into Z modeler with the edge crease and just uncrease anything that it shouldn't have. It's a lot faster than showing and hiding like I had to do back then. And then I can just kind of push stuff through and decide, does the cloth need to be pushed behind a piece of this so she can have her little smeller out, or just poke some holes in it. Little vents. Now if you're really fancy, you could go in and drop a ring right around those as a separate material, and those can be like metal eyelets or whatever. but this is just getting in the rough. And then adding your seams. And like I said, you could actually make a brush that does that seam. They even have one, I think. One of the defaults is just like a cut with two little ridges next to it. So make your own custom seam brush, and if it's too thick, go in there and pinch it back down.